And that day dawned when Arrakis lay at the hub of the universe with the wheel poised to spin. From Arrakis' Awakening by the Princess Irulan. "Will you look at that thing?" Stilgar whispered. Paul lay beside him in a slit of rock high on the shield wall rim, eye fixed to the collector of a Fremen telescope. The oil lens was focused on a starship lighter exposed by dawn in the basin below them. The tall eastern face of the ship glistened in the flat light of the sun, but the shadow side still showed yellow portholes from glow globes of the night. Beyond the ship, the city of Arrakeen lay cold and gleaming in the light of the northern sun. It wasn't the lighter that excited Stilgar's awe, Paul knew, but the construction for which the lighter was only the centre post. A single metal hutment, with many stories tall, reached out in a 1,000-metre circle from the base of the lighter, a tent composed of interlocking metal leaves, the temporary lodging place for 5 legions of Sardaukar and His Imperial Majesty, the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV. From his position squatting at Paul's left, Gurney Halleck said, "I count 9 levels to it. Must be quite a few Sardaukar in there." 5 legions, Paul said. "It grows light," Stilgar hissed. "We like it not. You're exposing yourself, Muad'Dib. Let us go back into the rocks now. I'm perfectly safe here," Paul said. "That ship mounts projectile weapons," Gurney said. "They believe us protected by shields," Paul said. "They wouldn't waste a shot on an unidentified trio even if they saw us." Paul swung the telescope to scan the far wall of the basin, seeing the pock-marked cliffs, the slides that marked the tombs of so many of his father's troopers, and he had a momentary sense of the fitness of things that the shades of those men should look down on this moment. The Harkonnen forts and towns across the shielded lands lay in Fremen hands or cut away from their source, like stalks severed from a plant and left to wither. Only this basin and its city remained to the enemy. "They might try a sortie by Thopter," Stilgar said. "If they see us." "Let them," Paul said. "We've Thopters to burn today, and we know a storm is coming." He swung the telescope to the far side of the Arrakeen landing field now, to the Harkonnen frigates lined up there with a Charm Company banner waving gently from its staff on the ground beneath them, and he thought of the desperation that had forced the guild to permit these 2 groups to land while the others were held in reverse. The guild was like a man testing the sand of his toe to gauge its temperature before erecting a tent. "Is there anything new to see from here?" the Gurney asked. "We should be getting under cover. The storm is coming." Paul returned his attention on the giant hutment. "They've even brought their women," he said, "and lackeys and servants. Ah, my dear Emperor, how confident you are." "Men are coming up the secret way," Stilgar said. "It may be Orvaim and Korba returning." "All right, still," Paul said. "We'll go back." But he took one final look around through the telescope, studying the plain with its tall ships, the gleaming metal hutment, the silent city, the frigates of the Harkonnen mercenaries. Then he slid backward around a scarp of rock. His place at the telescope was taken by a Fedakan guardsman. Paul emerged into a shallow depression in the shield wall surface. It was a place about 30 meters in diameter and some 3 meters deep, a natural feature of the rock that the Fremen had hidden beneath a translucent camouflage cover. Communications equipment was clustered around a hole in the wall to the right. Fedakan guards deployed through the depression waited for Muad'Dib's command to attack. 2 men emerged from the hole by the communications equipment, spoke to the guards there. Paul glanced at Stilgar, nodded in the direction of the 2 men, kept their report still. Stilgar moved to obey. Paul crouched with his back to the rock, stretching his muscles, straightened. He saw Stilgar sending the 2 men back into that dark hole in the rock, thought about the long climb down that narrow man-made tunnel to the floor of the basin. Stilgar crossed to Paul. "What was so important that they couldn't send a Cielago with the message?" Paul asked. "They're saving their birds for the battle," Stilgar said. He glanced at the communications equipment, back to Paul. "Even if a tight beam, it is wrong to use those things, Muad'Dib. They can find you by taking a bearing on its emission." "They'll soon be too busy to find me," Paul said. "What did the men report?" "Our pet Sardaukar have been released near Old Gap Low on the rim and are on their way to their master. The rocket launchers and other projectile weapons are in place. The people are deployed as you ordered. It was all routine." Paul glanced across the shallow bowl, studying his men in the filtered light admitted by the camouflage cover. He felt time creeping, like an insect working its way across an exposed rock. "It'll take our Sardaukar a little time afoot before they can signal a troop carrier," Paul said. "They are being watched?" "They are being watched," Stilgar said. Beside Paul, Gurney Halleck cleared his throat. "Hadn't we best be getting to a place of safety?" "There is no such place," Paul said. "Is the weather report still favourable?" "A great-grandmother of a storm coming," Stilgar said. "Can you not feel it, Muad'Dib?" The air does feel chancy, Paul agreed, but I like the certainty of polling the weather. The storm will be here in the hour, Stilgar said. He nodded toward the gap that looked out on the Emperor's Huntbent and the Harkonnen frigates. They know it there, too. Not a thopter in the sky. Everything pulled in and tied down. They've had a report on the weather from their friends in space. Any more probing sorties? Paul asked. Nothing since the landing last night, Stilgar said. They know we're here. I think now they wait to choose their own time. We choose the time, Paul said. Gurney glanced upward, growled. If they let us. That fleet'll stay in space, Paul said. Gurney shook his head. They have no choice, Paul said. We can destroy the spice. The guild dares not risk that. Desperate people are the most dangerous, Gurney said. Are we not desperate? Stilgar asked. Gurney scowled at him. You haven't lived of the Fremen dream, Paul cautioned. Still is thinking of all the water we've spent on bribes, the years of waiting we've added before Arrakis can bloom. He's not. Ah, Gurney growled. Why is he so gloomy? Stilgar asked. He's always gloomy before a battle, Paul said. It's the only form of good humour Gurney allows himself. A slow wolfish grin spread across Gurney's face, the teeth showing white above the chin cup of his stillsuit. It glooms me much to think on all the poor Harkonnen souls we'll dispatch unshriven, he said. Stilgar chuckled. He talks like a Fedakin. Gurney was born a deaf commando, Paul said, and he thought, yes, let them occupy their minds with small talk before we test ourselves against that force on the plain. He looked at the gap in the rock wall and back to Gurney, found that the troubadour warrior had resumed a brooding scowl. Worry saps the strength, Paul murmured. You told me that once, Gurney. My Duke, Gurney said. My chief worry is the atomics. If you use them to blast a hole in the shield wall, those people up there won't use atomics against us, Paul said. They don't dare, and for the same reason that they cannot risk our destroying the source of the spice. But the injunction, Paul barked. It's fear, not the injunction, that keeps the houses from hurling atomics against each other. The language of the Great Convention is clear enough. Use of atomics against humans shall be cause for planetary obliteration. We're going to blast the shield wall, not humans. It's too fine a point, Gurney said. The hair splitters up there will welcome any point, Paul said. Let's talk no more about it. He turned away, wishing he actually felt that confident. Presently he said, What about the city people? Are they in position yet? Yes, Stilgar muttered. Paul looked at him. What's eating you? I never knew the city man could be trusted completely, Stilgar said. I was a city man myself once, Paul said. Stilgar stiffened. His face grew dark with blood. Muad'Dib knows I did not mean. I know what you meant still, but the test of a man isn't what you think he'll do. It's what he actually does. These city people have Fremen blood. It's just that they haven't learned how to escape their bondage. We'll teach them. Stilgar nodded, spoke in a rueful tone. The habits of a lifetime, Muad'Dib. On the funeral plain we learned to despise the men of the communities. Paul glanced at Gurney, saw him studying Stilgar. Tell us, Gurney, why were the city folk down there driven from their homes by the Sardaukar? An old trick, my Duke. They fought to burden us with refugees. It's been so long since guerrillas were effective that the mighty have forgotten how to fight them, Paul said. The Sardaukar have played into our hands. They grabbed some city women for their sport, decorated their battle standards with the heads of the men who objected, and they've built up a fever of hate among people who otherwise would have looked on the coming battle as no more than a great inconvenience, and the possibility of exchanging one set of masters for another. The Sardaukar recruit for us, Stilgar. The city people do seem eager, Stilgar said. Their hate is fresh and clear, Paul said. That's why we use them as shock troops. The slaughter among them will be fearful, Gurney said. Stilgar nodded agreement. They were told the odds, Paul said. They know every Sardaukar leg hill will be one less for us. You see, gentlemen, they have something to die for. They've discovered they're a people. They're awakening. A muttered exclamation came from the watcher at the telescope. Paul moved to the rock slit, asked, What is it out there? A great commotion, Muad'Dib, the watcher hissed. At that monstrous metal tent, a surface car came from Rimwell West, and it was like a hawk into a nest of rock partridge. Our captive Sardaukar have arrived, Paul said. They've a shield around the entire landing field now, the watcher said. I can see the air dancing even to the edge of the storage yard where they kept the spice. Now they know who it is they fight, Gurney said. Let the Harkonnen beasts tremble and fret themselves so that Atreides yet lives. Paul spoke to the Fedakin at the telescope. Watch the flagpole atop the Emperor's ship. If my flag is raised there, it will not be, Gurney said. Paul saw the puzzled frown on Stilgar's face, said, If the Emperor recognizes my claim, he will signal by restoring the Atreides flag to Arrakis. We'll use the second plan then, move only against the Harkonnens. The Sardaukar will stand aside and let us settle the issue between ourselves. I have no experience of these off-world things, Stilgar said. I've heard of them, but it seems unlikely. You don't need experience to know what they'll do, Gurney said. They're sending a new flag up on the tall ship, the watcher said. The flag is yellow, with a black and red circle in the centre. There's a subtle piece of business, Paul said. The Choam Company flag. It's the same as the flag at the other ships, the Fedakan guard said. I don't understand, Stilgar said. A subtle piece of business indeed, Gurney said. Had he sent up the Atreides banner, he'd have had to live by what that meant. Too many observers about. He could have signalled with the Harkonnen flag on his staff. A flight declaration, that would have been. But no, he sends up the Choam rag. He's telling the people up there, Gurney pointed towards space, where the prophet is. He's saying he doesn't care if it's an Atreides here or not. How long till the storm strikes the shield wall? Paul asked. Stilgar turned away, consulted one of the Fedakin in the bowl. Presently he returned, said, Very soon, Muad'Dib, sooner than we expected. It's a great-great-grandmother of a storm, perhaps even more than you wished. It's my storm, Paul said, and saw the silent awe on the faces of the Fedakin who heard him. Though it shook the entire world, it could not be more than I wished. Will it strike the shield wall full on, close enough to make no difference? Stilgar said. A courier crossed from the hole that led down into the basin, said, The Sardaukar and Harkonnen patrols are pulling back, Muad'Dib. They expect the storm to spill too much sand into the basin for good visibility, Stilgar said. They think we'll be in the same fix. Tell our gunners to set their sights well before visibility drops, Paul said. They must knock the nose off every one of those ships as soon as the storm has destroyed the shields. He stepped to the wall of the bowl, pulled back a fold of the camouflage cover, and looked up at the sky. The horsetail twistings of blown sand could be seen against the dark of the sky. Paul restored the cover, said, Start sending our men down, still. Will you not go with us? Stilgar asked. I'll wait here a bit with the Fedakin, Paul said. Stilgar gave a knowing shrug toward Gurney, moved to the hole in the rock wall, lost in its shadow. The trigger that blasts the shield wall aside, but I leave in your hands, Paul said. You will do it? I'll do it. Paul gestured to a Fedakin lieutenant, said, Of aim. Start moving the Czech patrols out of the blast area. They must be out of there before the storm strikes. The man bowed, followed Stilgar. Gurney leaned into the rock slit, spoke to the man at the telescope. Keep your attention on the south wall. It'll be completely undefended until we blow it. Dispatch a Silago with a time signal, Paul ordered. Some ground cars are moving toward the south wall, the man at the telescope said. Some are using projectile weapons testing. Our people are using body shields as you commanded. The ground cars have stopped. In the abrupt silence, Paul heard the wind devils playing overhead, the front of the storm. Sand began to drift down into their bowl through gaps in the cover. A burst of wind caught the cover, whipped it away. Paul motioned his Fedakin to take shelter, crossed to the men at the communications equipment near the tunnel mouth. Gurney stayed beside him. Paul crouched over the signalman. One said, A great-great-great-grandmother of a storm, Muad'Dib. Paul glanced up at the darkening sky, said, Gurney, have the south wall observers pulled out. He had to repeat his order, shouting above the growing noise of the storm. Gurney turned to obey. Paul fastened his face filter, tightened the stillsuit hood. Gurney returned. Paul touched his shoulder, pointed to the blast trigger set into the tunnel mouth beyond the signalman. Gurney went into the tunnel, stopped there, one hand at the trigger, his gaze on Paul. We are getting no messages, the signalman beside Paul said. Much static. Paul nodded, kept his eye on the time-standard dial in front of the signalman. Presently, Paul looked at Gurney, raised a hand, returned his attention to the dial. The time counter crawled around its final circuit. Now, Paul shouted, and dropped his hand. Gurney depressed the blast trigger. It seemed that a full second passed before they felt the ground beneath them ripple and shake. A rumbling sound was added to the storm's roar. The Fedakin watcher from the telescope appeared beside Paul, the telescope clutched under one arm. The shield wall is breached, Muad'Dib, he shouted. The storm is on them, and our gunners already are firing. Paul thought of the storm sweeping across the basin, the static charge of it in the wall of sand that destroyed every shield barrier in the enemy camp. The storm, someone shouted. We must get under cover, Muad'Dib. Paul came to his senses, feeling the sand needles sting his exposed cheeks. We are committed, he thought. He put an arm around the signalman's shoulder, said, Leave the equipment. There's more in the tunnel. He felt himself being pulled away. Fedakin pressed around him to protect him. They squeezed into the tunnel mouth, feeling its comparative silence, turned a corner into a small chamber with glow globes overhead and another tunnel opening beyond. Another signalman sat there at his equipment. Much static, the man said. A swirl of sand filled the air around them. Seal off this tunnel, Paul shouted. A sudden pressure of stillness showed then that his command had been obeyed. "Is the way down to the basin still open?" Paul asked. Dakin went to look, returned, said, "The explosion caused a little rock to fall, but the engineers say it is still open. They're cleaning up with las beams." "Tell them to use their hands," Paul barked. "There are shields active down there." "They are being careful, Muad'Dib," the man said, but he turned to obey. The signalman from outside pressed past them carrying their equipment. I told those men to leave their equipment," Paul said. "Fremen do not like to abandon equipment, Muad'Dib," one of his Fedakin chided. "Men are more important than equipment now," Paul said. "We'll have more equipment than we can use. Soon we'll have no need for equipment." Gurney Halleck came up beside him, said, "I heard them say the way down is open. We're very close to the surface here, my lord. Should the Harkonnens try to retaliate in kind?" "They're in no position to retaliate," Paul said. "They're just now finding out that they have no shields and are unable to get off Arrakis. The new command post is all prepared, though, my lord," Gurney said. "They have no need of me in the command post yet," Paul said. "The plan would go ahead without me. We must wait for the—" "I'm getting a message, Muad'Dib," said the signalman at the communications equipment. The man shook his head, pressed a receiver phone against his ear. Much static. He began scribbling on a pad in front of him, shaking his head, waiting. Paul crossed to the signalman's side. The Fedakin stepped back, giving him room. He looked down at what the man had written. Raid. On Siege Tabur. Captives. Alia. Blank. Families of blank dead are they blank. Son of Muad'Dib. Again the signalman shook his head. Paul looked up to see Gurney staring at him. "The message is garbled," Gurney said. "The static. You don't know that." "My son is dead," Paul said, and knew as he spoke that it was true. "My son is dead, and Alia is a captive. Hostage." He felt emptied, a shell without emotions. Everything he touched brought death and grief, and it was like a disease that could spread across the universe. He could feel the old man wisdom, the accumulation out of the experiences from countless possible lives. Something seemed to chuckle and rub its hands within him, and Paul thought how little the universe knows about the nature of real cruelty. And Muad'Dib stood before them, and he said, "Though we deem the captive dead, yet does she live. For her seed is my seed, and her voice is my voice, and she sees unto the farthest reaches of possibility. Yea, unto the veil of the unknowable does she see because of me." From Arrakis Awakening by the Princess Irulan. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen stood with eyes downcast in the Imperial Audience Chamber, the oval Selamlik within the Padishah Emperor's hutment. With covert glances, the Baron had studied the metal-walled room and its occupants, the Naukas, the pages, the guards, the troop of the House Sardaukar, drawn up around the walls, standing at ease there beneath the bloody and tattered captured battle flags that were the room's only decoration. Voices sounded from the right of the chamber, echoing out of a high passage. Make way for the royal person." The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV came out of the passage into the audience chamber, followed by his suite. He stood waiting while his throne was brought, ignoring the Baron, seemingly ignoring every person in the room. The Baron found that he could not ignore the royal person, and studied the Emperor for a sign, any clue to the purpose of this audience. The Emperor stood poised, waiting, a slim, elegant figure in a grey Sardaukar uniform with silver and gold trim. His thin face and cold eyes reminded the Baron of the Duke Leto long dead. There was that same look of the predatory bird, but the Emperor's hair was red, not black, and most of that hair was concealed by a Bersegg's ebon helmet with the imperial crest in gold upon its crown. Pages brought the throne. It was a massive chair carved from a single piece of Hagal quartz. Blue-green translucency shot through with streaks of yellow fire. They placed it on the dais, and the Emperor mounted, seated himself. An old woman in a black Abar robe with hood drawn down over her forehead detached herself from the Emperor's suite, took up station behind the throne, one scrawny hand resting on the quartz back. Her face peered out of the hood like a witch caricature, sunken cheeks and eyes, an overlong nose, skin mottled and with protruding veins. The Baron stilled his trembling at sight of her. The presence of the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mahayim, the Emperor's truthsayer, betrayed the importance of this audience. The Baron looked away from her, studied the suite for a clue. There were two of the guild agents, one tall and fat, one short and fat, both with bland grey eyes, and among the lackeys stood one of the Emperor's daughters, the Princess Irulan, A woman, they said, was being trained in the deepest of the Bene Gesserit ways, destined to be a reverend mother. She was tall, blonde, face of chiseled beauty, green eyes that looked past and through him. My dear Baron. The Emperor had deigned to notice him. The voice was baritone with exquisite control. He managed to dismiss him while greeting him. The Baron bowed low, advanced to the required 10 paces from the dais. I came at your summons, Majesty. Summons, the old witch cackled. Now, Reverend Mother, the Emperor chided, but he smiled at the Baron's discomfiture, said, First you will tell me where you've sent your minion, Fufa Hawat. The Baron darted his gaze left and right, reviled himself for coming here without his own guards, not that they'd be much use against Sardaukar. Still, well, the Emperor said, he has been gone these 5 days, Majesty. The Baron shot a glance at the guild agents, back to the Emperor. He was to land at a smuggler base and attempt infiltrating the camp of the Fremen fanatic, this Muad'Dib. Incredible, the Emperor said. One of the witch's claw-like hands tapped the Emperor's shoulder. She leaned forward, whispered in his ear. The Emperor nodded, said, 5 days, Baron. Tell me, why aren't you worried about his absence? But I am worried, Majesty. The Emperor continued to stare at him, waiting. The Reverend Mother emitted a cackling laugh. What I mean, Majesty, the Baron said, is that Howard will be dead within another few hours anyway. And he explained about the latent poison and need for an antidote. How clever of you, Baron, the Emperor said. And where are your nephews, Raban and the young Fade Ralpha? The storm comes, Majesty. I send them to inspect our perimeter lest the Fremen attack under cover of the sand. Perimeter, the Emperor said. The word came out as though it puckered his mouth. The storm won't be much here in the basin, and that Fremen rabble won't attack while I'm here with 5 legions of Sardaukar. Surely not, Majesty, the Baron said, but error on the side of caution cannot be censured. Ah, the Emperor said, censure. But I am not to speak of how much time the Arrakis nonsense has taken from me, nor the Chom Company profits pouring down this rat hole, not the court functions and affairs of state I've had to delay, even cancel, because of this stupid affair. The Baron lowered his gaze, frightened by the imperial anger. The delicacy of his position here, alone and dependent upon the convention and the dictum familiar of the great houses, fretted him. Does he mean to kill me? The Baron asked himself. He couldn't. Not with the other great houses waiting up there, aching for any excuse to gain from this upset on Arrakis. Have you taken hostages? The Emperor asked. It's useless, Majesty, the Baron said. These mad Fremen hold a burial ceremony for every captive and act as though such a one were already dead. So, the Emperor said, and the Baron waited, glancing left and right at the metal walls of the Selamlik, thinking of the monstrous fan-metal tent around him. Such unlimited wealth it represented that even the Baron was awed. He brings pages, the Baron thought, and useless court lackeys, his women and their companions, hairdressers, designers, everything, all the fringe parasites of the court. All here, fawning, slyly plotting, roughing it with the Emperor, here to watch him put an end to this affair, to make epigrams over the battles and idolize the wounded. Perhaps you've never sought the right kind of hostages, the Emperor said. He knows something, the Baron thought. Fear sat like a stone in his stomach until he could hardly bear the thought of eating. Yet the feeling was like hunger, and he poised himself several times in his suspenses on the point of ordering food brought to him, but there was no one here to obey his summons. Do you have any idea who this Muad'Dib could be? The Emperor asked. One of the Umma, surely, the Baron said. A Fremen fanatic, a religious adventurer. They crop up regularly on the fringes of civilization. Your Majesty knows this. The Emperor glanced at his truthsayer, turned back to scowl at the Baron. And you have no other knowledge of this Muad'Dib. A madman, the Baron said. But all Fremen are a little mad. Mad? His people scream his name as they leap into battle. The women throw their babies at us and hurl themselves onto our knives to open a wedge for their men to attack us. They have no decency. As bad as that, the Emperor murmured, and his tone of derision did not escape the Baron. Tell me, my dear Baron, have you investigated the southern polar regions of Arrakis? The Baron stared up at the Emperor, shocked by the change of subject. But, well, you know, Your Majesty, the entire region is uninhabitable, open to wind and worm. There's not even any spice in those latitudes. You've had no reports from spice lighters that patches of greenery appear there? There have always been such reports. Some were investigated, long ago. A few plants were seen. Many foppers were lost. Much too costly, Your Majesty. It's a place where men cannot survive for long. So, the Emperor said. He snapped his fingers and a door opened at the left behind the throne. Through the door came 2 Sardaukar holding a girl child who appeared to be about 4 years old. She wore a black abar, the hood thrown back to reveal the attachments of a stillsuit hanging free at her throat. Her eyes were Fremen blue, staring out of a soft, round face. She appeared completely unafraid, and there was a look to her stare that made the Baron feel uneasy for no reason he could explain. Even the old Bene Gesserit truthsayer drew back as the child passed and made a warding sign in her direction. The old witch obviously was shaken by the child's presence. The Emperor cleared his throat to speak, but the child spoke first, a thin voice of traces of a soft, palate lisp, but clear nonetheless. "So here he is," she said. She advanced to the edge of the dais. "He doesn't appear much, does he? One frightened old fat man too weak to support his own flesh without the help of suspensors." It was such a totally unexpected statement from the mouth of a child that the Baron stared at her, speechless in spite of his anger. "Is it a midget?" he asked himself. "My dear Baron," the Emperor said, "become acquainted with the sister of Muad'Dib." The Baron shifted his attention to the Emperor. "I do not understand." "I, too, sometimes err on the side of caution," the Emperor said. "It has been reported to me that your uninhabited South Polar regions exhibit evidence of human activity." "But that's impossible," the Baron protested. "The worms, the sand clear to the... These people seem able to avoid the worms," the Emperor said. The child sat down on the dais beside the throne, dangled her feet over the edge, kicking them. There was such an air of sureness in the way she appraised her surroundings. The Baron stared at the kicking feet, the way they moved the black robe, the wink of sandals beneath the fabric. "Unfortunately," the Emperor said, "I only sent 5 troop carriers of a light attack force to pick up prisoners for questioning. We barely got away with 3 prisoners and 1 carrier. Mind you, Baron, my Sardaukar were almost overwhelmed by a force composed mostly of women, children, and old men. This child here was in command of one of the attacking groups." "You see, Your Majesty," the Baron said. "You see how they are?" "I allowed myself to be captured," the child said. "I did not want to face my brother and have to tell him that his son had been killed." "Only a handful of our men got away," the Emperor said. "Got away. You hear that?" "We'd have had them too," the child said, "except for the flames. My Sardaukar used the attitudinal jets on their carrier as flamethrowers," the Emperor said. "A move of desperation, and the only thing that got them away with their 3 prisoners. Mark that, my dear Baron. Sardaukar forced to retreat in confusion from women and children and old men. We must attack in force," the Baron rasped. "We must destroy every last vestige of..." "Silence!" the Emperor roared. He pushed himself forward on his throne. "Do not abuse my intelligence any longer. You stand there in your foolish innocence and majesty," the old truthsayer said. He waved her to silence. "You say you don't know about the activity we found, nor the fighting qualities of these superb people." The Emperor lifted himself half off his throne. "What do you take me for, Baron?" The Baron took 2 backward steps, thinking it was Raban. "He has done this to me. Raban has..." "And this fake dispute with Duke Leto," the Emperor purred, sinking back into his throne. "How beautifully you maneuvered it." "Majesty," the Baron pleaded, "what are you..." "Silence!" The old Bene Gesserit put a hand on the Emperor's shoulder, leaned close to whisper in his ear. The child seated on the dais stopped kicking her feet, said, "Make him afraid some more, Shaddam. I shouldn't enjoy this, but I find the pleasure impossible to suppress." "Quiet, child," the Emperor said. He leaned forward, put a hand on her head, stared at the Baron. "Is it possible, Baron? Could you be as simple-minded as my truthsayer suggests? Do you not recognize this child, daughter of your ally, Duke Leto?" "My father was never his ally," the child said. "My father is dead, and this old Harkonnen beast has never seen me before." The Baron was reduced to stupefied glaring. When he found his voice, it was only to rasp. "Who?" "I am Alia, daughter of Duke Leto and the Lady Jessica, sister of Duke Paul Muad'Dib," the child said. She pushed herself off the dais, dropped to the floor of the audience chamber. "My brother has promised to have your head atop his battle standard, and I think he shall." "Be hushed, child," the Emperor said, and he sank back into his throne, hand to chin, studying the Baron. "I did not take the Emperor's orders," Alia said. She turned, looked up at the old Reverend Mother. "She knows." The Emperor glanced up at the truthsayer. "What does she mean?" "That child is an abomination," the old woman said. "Her mother deserves a punishment greater than anything in history. Death. It cannot come too quickly for that child, or for the one who spawned her." The old woman pointed a finger at Alia. "Get out of my mind." "TP?" the Emperor whispered. He snapped his attention back to Alia. "By the Great Mother." "You don't understand, Majesty," the old woman said. "Not telepathy. She's in my mind. She's like the ones before me, the ones who gave me their memories. She stands in my mind. She cannot be there, but she is. What others? The Emperor demanded. What's this nonsense? The old woman straightened, lowered her pointing hand. I've said too much, but the fact remains that this child, who is not a child, must be destroyed. Long were we warned against such a one and how to prevent such a birth, but one of our own has betrayed us. You babble, old woman, Alia said. You don't know how it was, yet you rattle on like a purblind fool. Alia closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and held it. The old Reverend Mother groaned and staggered. Alia opened her eyes. That is how it was, she said. A cosmic accident, and you played your part in it. The Reverend Mother held out both hands, palms pushing the air towards Alia. What is happening here? The Emperor demanded. Child, can you truly project your thoughts into the mind of another? That's not how it is at all, Alia said. Unless I'm born as you, I cannot think as you. Kill her, the old woman muttered, and clutched the back of the throne for support. Kill her. The sunken old eyes glared at Alia. Silence, the Emperor said, and he studied Alia. Child, can you communicate with your brother? My brother knows I'm here, Alia said. Can you tell him to surrender as the price of your life? Alia smiled up at him with clear innocence. I shall not do that, she said. The Baron stumbled forward to stand beside Alia. Majesty, he pleaded, I knew nothing of— Interrupt me once more, Baron, the Emperor said, and you will lose the powers of interruption forever. He kept his attention focused on Aha, studying her through slitted lids. You will not, eh? Can you read in my mind what I'll do if you disobey me? I've already said I cannot read minds, she said, but one doesn't need telepathy to read your intentions. The Emperor scowled. Child, your cause is hopeless. I have but to rally my forces and reduce this planet to— It's not that simple, Alia said. She looked at the two guildsmen. Ask them. It is not wise to go against my desires, the Emperor said. You should not deny me the least thing. My brother comes now, Alia said. Even an emperor may tremble before Muad'Dib, for he has the strength of righteousness and heaven smiles upon him. The Emperor surged to his feet. This play has gone far enough. I will take your brother and this planet and grind them to— The room rumbled and shook around them. There came a sudden cascade of sand behind the throne where the hutman was coupled to the Emperor's ship. The abrupt flicker tightening of skin pressure told of a wide area shield being activated. I told you, Alia said. My brother comes. The Emperor stood in front of his throne, right hand pressed to right ear, the servo receiver there chattering in support on the situation. The Baron moved 2 steps behind Alia. Sardaukar were leaping into positions at the doors. We will fall back into space and reform, the Emperor said. Baron, my apologies. These madmen are attacking under cover of the storm. We will show them an Emperor's wrath then. He pointed at Alia. Give her body to the storm. As he spoke, Alia fled backward, feigning terror. Let the storm have what it can take, she screamed, and she backed into the Baron's arms. I have her, Majesty, the Baron shouted. Shall I dispatch her now? Yay! He held her to the floor, clutched his left arm. I'm sorry, grandfather, Alia said. You've met the Atreides Gom-Jabbar. She got to her feet, dropped a dark needle from her hand. The Baron fell back. His eyes bulged as he stared at a red slash on his left palm. You... He rolled sideways in his suspensors, a sagging mass of flesh supported inches off the floor, with head lolling and a mouth hanging open. These people are insane, the Emperor snarled. Quick, into the ship. We'll purge this planet of every— Something sparkled to his left. A roll of ball lightning bounced away from the wall there, crackled as it touched a metal floor. The smell of burnt insulation swept through the Selamlik. The shield, one of the Sardaukar officers shouted. The outer shield is down. His words were drowned in a metallic roaring as the ship roll behind the Emperor trembled and rocked. They've shot the nose off our ship, someone called. Dust boiled through the room. Under its cover, Alia leaped up, ran toward the outer door. The Emperor whirled, motioned his people into an emergency door that swung open in the ship's side behind the throne. He flashed a hand signal to a Sardaukar officer leaping through the dust haze. We will make our stand here, the Emperor ordered. Another crash shook the hutment. The double doors banged open at the far side of the chamber, admitting wind-blown sand and the sound of shouting. A small black-robed figure could be seen momentarily against the light. Alia darting out to find a knife and, as befitted her Fremen training, to kill Harkonnen and Sardaukar wounded. House Sardaukar charged through a green-yellow haze toward the opening, weapons ready, forming an arc there to protect the Emperor's retreat. Save yourself, sire, a Sardaukar officer shouted. Into the ship. But the Emperor stood alone now on his dais, pointing toward the doors. A 40-meter section of the hutment had been blasted away there, and the Selamlik's doors opened now onto drifting sand. A dust cloud hung low over the outside world, blowing from pastel distances. Static lightning crackled from the cloud, and the spark flashes of shields being shorted out by the storm's charge, could be seen through the haze. The plain surged with figures in combat, Sardaukar and leaping, gyrating robed men who seemed to come down out of the storm. All this was as a frame for the target of the Emperor's pointing hand. Out of the sand haze came an orderly mass of flashing shapes, great rising curves of crystal spokes that resolved into the gaping mouths of sandworms, a massed wall of them, each with troops of Fremen riding to the attack. They came in a hissing wedge, robes whipping in the wind as they cut through the melee on the plain. Onward toward the Emperor's hutman they came, while the House Sardaukar stood awed for the first time in their history by an onslaught their minds found difficult to accept. But the figures leaping from the worm backs were men, and the blades flashing in that ominous yellow light were a thing the Sardaukar had been trained to face. They threw themselves into combat, and was man-to-man on the plain of Arrakeen, while a picked Sardaukar bodyguard pressed the Emperor back into the ship, sealed the door on him, and prepared to die at that door as part of his shield. In the shock of comparative silence within the ship, the Emperor stared at the wide-eyed faces of his suite, seeing his oldest daughter with the flush of exertion on her cheeks, the old truthsayer standing like a black shadow with her hood pulled about her face, finding at last the faces he sought. The two guildsmen. They wore the guild grey, unadorned, and it seemed to fit the calm they maintained despite the high emotions around them. The taller of the two, though, held a hand to his left eye. As the Emperor watched, someone jostled the guildsman's arm. The hand moved, and the eye was revealed. The man had lost one of his masking contact lenses, and the eye stared out a total blue, so dark as to be almost black. The smaller of the pair elbowed his way a step nearer to the Emperor, said, "We cannot know how it will go." And the taller companion, hand restored to eye, added in a cold voice, "But this Muad'Dib cannot know either." The words shocked the Emperor out of his daze. He checked the scorn on his tongue by a visible effort, because it did not take Guild Navigator's single-minded focus on the main chance to see the immediate future out on that plain. Were these two so dependent upon their faculty that they had lost the use of their eyes and their reason? He wondered. "Reverend Mother," he said, "we must devise a plan." She pulled the hood from her face, met his gaze with an unblinking stare. The look that passed between them carried complete understanding. They had one weapon left and both knew it. Treachery. "Summon Count Fenring from his quarters," the Reverend Mother said. The Badashah Emperor nodded, waved for one of his aides to obey that command. He was warrior and mystic, ogre and saint, the fox and the innocent, chivalrous, ruthless, less than a god, more than a man. There was no measuring Muad'Dib's motives by ordinary standards. In the moment of his triumph, he saw the death prepared for him, yet he accepted the treachery. Can you say he did this out of a sense of justice? Whose justice, then? Remember, we speak now of the Muad'Dib who ordered battle drums made from his enemies' skins, the Muad'Dib who denied the conventions of his ducal past with a wave of the hand, saying merely, "I am the Kwisatz Haderach." That is reason enough. From Arrakis Awakening by the Princess Irulan. It was to the Arrakin governor's mansion, the old residency the Atreides had first occupied on Dune, that they escorted Paul Muad'Dib on the evening of his victory. The building stood as Rabban had restored it, virtually untouched by the fighting, although there had been looting by townspeople. Some of the furnishings in the main hall had been overturned or smashed. Paul strode through the main entrance with Gurney Halleck and Stilgar a pace behind. Their escort fanned out into the great hall, straightening the place and clearing an area for Muad'Dib. One squad began investigating, but no sly trap had been planted here. "I remember the day we first came here with your father," Gurney said. He glanced around at the beams in the high-slitted windows. "I didn't like this place then, and I like it less now. One of our caves would be safer." "Spoken like a true Fremen," Stilgar said, and he marked the cold smile that his words brought to Muad'Dib's lips. "Will you reconsider, Muad'Dib?" "This place is a symbol," Paul said. "Rabban lived here. By occupying this place, I seal my victory for all to understand. Send men through the building. Touch nothing. Just be certain no Harkonnen people or toys remain." "As you command," Stilgar said, and reluctance was heavy in his tone as he turned to obey. Communications men hurried into the room with their equipment, began setting up near the massive fireplace. The Fremen guard that augmented the surviving Fedakin took up stations around the room. There was muttering among them, much darting of suspicious glances. This had been too long a place of the enemy for them to accept their presence in it casually. "Gurney, have an escort bring my mother and Chani," Paul said. "Does Chani know yet about our son?" "The message was sent, my lord." "Are the makers being taken out of the basin yet?" "Yes, my lord. The storm's almost spent." "What's the extent of the storm damage?" Paul asked. "In the direct path, on the landing field and across the spice storage yards of the plain." "Extensive damage," Gurney said. "As much from battle as from the storm. Nothing money won't repair, I presume," Paul said. "Except for the lives, my lord," Gurney said. and there was a touch of reproach in his voice as though to say, when did an Atreides worry first about things when people were at stake? But Paul could only focus his attention on the inner eye and the gaps visible to him in the time wall that still lay across his path. Through each gap the jihad raged away down the corridors of the future. He sighed, across the hall, seeing a chair against the wall. The chair had once stood in the dining hall and might even have held his own father. At the moment, though, it was only an object to rest his weariness and conceal it from the men. He sat down, pulling his robes around his legs, loosening his steel suit at the neck. The Emperor is still holed up in the remains of his ship, Gurney said. For now, contain him there, Paul said. Have you found the Harkonnens yet? They're still examining the dead. Or reply from the ships up there. He jerked his chin toward the ceiling. No reply yet, my lord. Paul sighed, resting against the back of his chair. Presently, he said, bring me a captive Sardaukar. We must send a message to our Emperor. It's time to discuss terms. Yes, my lord. Gurney turned away, dropped a hand signal to one of the Fedaykin who took up close guard position beside Paul. Gurney, Paul whispered, since you've been rejoined, I've yet to hear you produce the proper quotation for the event. He turned, saw Gurney swallow, saw the sudden grim hardening of the man's jaw. As you wish, my lord, Gurney said. He cleared his throat, rasped. And the victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people, for the people heard say that day how the king was grieved for his son. Paul closed his eyes, forcing grief out of his mind, letting it wait as he had once waited to mourn his father. Now he gave his thoughts over to this day's accumulated discoveries, the mixed futures and the hidden presence of Alia within his awareness. Of all the uses of time vision, this was the strangest. I have breasted the future to place my words where only you can hear them, Alia had said. Even you cannot do that, my brother. I find it an interesting play, and, oh yes, I've killed our grandfather, the demented old baron. He had very little pain. Silence. His time sense had seen her withdrawal. Muad'Dib. Paul opened his eyes to see Stilgar's black-bearded visage above him, the dark eyes glaring with battle light. You found the body of the old baron, Paul said. A hush of the person settled over Stilgar. How could you know? He whispered. We just found the body in that great pile of metal the Emperor built. Paul ignored the question, seeing Gurney return accompanied by two Fremen who supported the captive Sardaukar. Here's one of them, my lord, Gurney said. He signed to the guard to hold the captive 5 paces in front of Paul. The Sardaukar's eyes, Paul noted, carried a glazed expression of shock. A blue bruise stretched from the bridge of his nose to the corner of his mouth. He was of the blonde, chisel-featured cast, the look that seemed synonymous with rank among the Sardaukar, yet there were no insignia on his torn uniform except the gold buttons with the imperial crest in the tattered braid of his trousers. I think this one's an officer, my lord, Gurney said. Paul nodded, said, I am the Duke Paul Atreides. Do you understand that, man? The Sardaukar stared at him, unmoving. Speak up, Paul said, or your emperor may die. The man blinked, swallowed. Who am I? Paul demanded. You are the Duke Paul Atreides, the man husked. He seemed too submissive to Paul, but then the Sardaukar had never been prepared for such happenings as this day. They'd never known anything but victory, which, Paul realized, could be a weakness in itself. He put that thought aside for later, consideration in his own training program. I have a message for you to carry to the Emperor, Paul said, and he couched his words in the ancient formula. I, a duke of a great house, an imperial kinsman, give my word of bond under the convention. If the Emperor and his people lay down their arms and come to me here, I will guard their lives with my own. Paul held up his left hand with the ducal signet for the Sardaukar to see. I swear it by this. The man wet his lips with his tongue, glanced at Gurney. Yes, Paul said, who but an Atreides could command the allegiance of Gurney Halleck? I will carry the message, the Sardaukar said. Take him to our forward command post and send him in, Paul said. Yes, my lord. Gurney motioned for the guard to obey, led them out. Paul turned back to Stilgar. Chani and your mother have arrived, Stilgar said. Chani has asked time to be alone with her grief. The Reverend Mother sought a moment in the waiting room. I know not why. My mother's sick with longing for a planet she may never see, Paul said, where water falls from the sky and plants grow so thickly you cannot walk between them. Water from the sky, Stilgar whispered. In that instant, Paul saw how Stilgar had been transformed from the Fremen Naib to a creature of the Lisan al-Gaib, a receptacle for awe and obedience. It was a lessening of the man, and Paul felt the ghost wind of the jihad in it. I've seen a friend become a worshipper, he thought. In a rush of loneliness, Paul glanced around the room, noting how proper and on review his guards had become in his presence. He sensed a subtle, prideful competition among them, each hoping for notice from Muad'Dib. Muad'Dib, from whom all blessings flow, he thought, and it was the bitterest thought of his life. They sense that I must take the throne, he thought, but they cannot know I do it to prevent the jihad. Stilgar cleared his throat, said, Raban too is dead, Paul nodded. Guards to the right suddenly snapped aside, standing at attention to open an aisle for Jessica. She wore her black aber and walked with a hint of striding across sand, but Paul noted how this house had restored to her something of what she had once been here, as concubine to a ruling duke. Her presence carried some of its old assertiveness. Jessica stopped in front of Paul, looked down at him. She saw his fatigue and how he hid it, but found no compassion for him. It was as though he had been rendered incapable of any emotion for her son. Jessica had entered the great hall, wondering why the place refused to fit itself snugly into her memories. There remained a foreign room, as though she had never walked here with her beloved Leto, never confronted a drunken Duncan Idaho here. Never, never, never. There should be a word tension directly opposite to adab, the demanding memory, she thought. There should be a word for memories that deny themselves. Where is Alia? She asked. Out doing what any good Fremen child should be doing in such times, Paul said. She's killing enemy wounded and marking their bodies for the water recovery teams. Paul must understand that she does this out of kindness, he said. Isn't it odd how we misunderstand the hidden unity of kindness and cruelty? Jessica glared at her son, shocked by the profound change in him. Was it his child's death did this? She wondered, and she said, The men tell strange stories of you, Paul. They say you've all the powers of the legend. Nothing can be hidden from you, that you see what others cannot see. A Bene Gesserit should ask about legends? He asked. I've had a hand in whatever you are, she admitted, but you mustn't expect me to. How would you like to live billions upon billions of lives? Paul asked. There's a fabric of legends for you. Think of all those experiences, the wisdom they'd bring. But wisdom tempers love, doesn't it? And it puts a new shape on hate. How can you tell what's ruthless unless you've plumbed the depths of both cruelty and kindness? You should fear me, mother. I am the Kwisatz Haderach. Jessica tried to swallow in a dry throat. Presently she said, Once you denied to me that you were the Kwisatz Haderach. Paul shook his head. I can deny nothing any more. He looked up into her eyes. The Emperor and his people come now. They will be announced any moment. Stand beside me. I wish a clear view of them. My future bride will be among them. Paul, Jessica snapped. Don't make the mistake your father made. She's a princess, Paul said. She's my key to the throne, and that's all she'll ever be. Mistake? You think because I'm what you made me that I cannot feel the need for revenge? Even on the innocent? She asked, and she thought, He must not make the mistakes I made. There are no innocent anymore, Paul said. Tell that to Chani, Jessica said, and gestured toward the passage from the rear of the residency. Chani entered the great hall there, walking between the Fremen guards as though unaware of them. Her hood and steel suit cap were thrown back, face mask fastened aside. She walked with a fragile uncertainty as she crossed the room to stand beside Jessica. Paul saw the marks of tears on her cheeks. She gives water to the dead. He felt a pang of grief strike through him, but it was as though he could only feel this thing through Chani's presence. He is dead, beloved, Chani said. Our son is dead. Holding himself under his stiff control, Paul got to his feet. He reached out, touched Chani's cheek, felt the dampness of her tears. He cannot be replaced, Paul said, but there will be other sons. It is Usul who promises this. Gently he moved her aside, gestured to Stilgar. Muad'Dib, Stilgar said. They come from the ship. The Emperor and his people, Paul said. I will stand here. Assemble the captives in an open space in the center of the room. They will be kept at a distance of 10 meters from me unless I command otherwise. As you command, Muad'Dib. As Stilgar turned to obey, Paul heard the awed muttering of Bremen guards. You see? He knew. No one told him, but he knew. The Emperor's entourage could be heard approaching now, his Sardaukar humming one of their marching tunes to keep up their spirits. There came a murmur of voices at the entrance, and Gurney Halleck passed through the guard, crossed to confer with Stilgar. They moved to Paul's side, a strange look in his eyes. Will I lose Gurney too? Paul wondered. The way I lost Stilgar, losing a friend to gain a creature. They have no throwing weapons, Gurney said. I've made sure of that myself. He glanced around the room, seeing Paul's preparations. Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen is with them. Shall I cut him out? Leave him. There are some guild people too, demanding special privileges, threatening an embargo against Arrakis. I told them I'd give you their message. Let them threaten. Paul, Jessica hissed behind him. He's talking about the guild. I'll pull their fangs presently, Paul said, and he thought then about the guild, the force that had specialized for so long that it had become a parasite, unable to exist independently of the life upon which it fed. They had never dared grasp the sword, and now they could not grasp it. They might have taken Arrakis when they realized the error of specializing on the melange, so away in a spectrum narcotic for their navigators. They could have done this, lived their glorious day, and died. Instead, they existed from moment to moment, hoping the seas in which they swam might produce a new host when the old one died. The guild navigators, gifted with limited prescience, then made the fatal decision. They'd chosen always the clear, safe course that leads ever downward into stagnation. Let them look closely at their new host, Paul thought. There's also a B'nai Gesserit Reverend Mother who says she's a friend of your mother, Gurney said. My mother has no B'nai Gesserit friends. Again, Gurney glanced around the great hall, then bent close to Paul's ear. Fufa Howart's with him, my lord. I had no chance to see him alone, but he used our old hand signs to say he's been working with the Harkonnens, thought you were dead. Says he's to be left among them. We left Fufa among those. He wanted it, and I thought it best. If there's something wrong, he's where we can control him. If not, with an ear on the other side. Paul thought then of prescient glimpses into the possibilities of this moment, and one timeline where Fufa carried a poisoned needle, which the Emperor commanded he use against his upstart duke. The entrance guard stepped aside, formed a short corridor of lances. There came a murmurous swish of garments, feet rasping the sand that had drifted into the residency. The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV led his people into the hall. His Berserk helmet had been lost, and the red hair stood out in disarray. His uniform's left sleeve had been ripped along the inner seam. He was beltless and without weapons, but his presence moved with him like a force shield bubble that kept his immediate area open. A Fremen lance dropped along across his path, stopped him where Paul had ordered. The others bunched up behind, a montage of colour, of shuffling and of staring faces. Paul swept his gaze across the group, saw women who hid signs of weeping, saw the lackeys who had come to enjoy the grandstand seats at a Sardaukar victory, and now stood choked to silence by defeat. Paul saw the bird-bright eyes of the Reverend Mother Goddess Helen Mahayam glaring beneath her black hood, and beside her the narrow furtiveness of Fade Rafa Harkonnen. There's a face time betrayed to me, Paul thought. He looked beyond Fade Rafa then, attracted by a movement, seeing there a narrow weaselish face he'd never before encountered, not in time or out of it. It was a face he felt he should know, and the feeling carried with it a marker of fear. Why should I fear that man? He wondered. He leaned toward his mother, whispered, That man to the left of the Reverend Mother, the evil-looking one. Who is that? Jessica looked, recognizing the face from her Duke's dossiers. Count Fenring, she said. The one who was here immediately before us, a genetic eunuch, and a killer. The Emperor's errand boy, Paul thought. And the thought was a shock crashing across his consciousness because he had seen the Emperor in uncounted associations spread through the possible futures, but never once had Count Fenring appeared within those prescient visions. It occurred to Paul that he had seen his own dead body along countless reaches of the time web, but never once had he seen his moment of death. Have I been denied a glimpse of this man because he is the one who kills me? Paul wondered. The thought sent a pang of foreboding through him. He forced his attention away from Fenring, looked now at the remnants of Sardaukar men and officers, the bitterness on their faces and the desperation. Here and there among them, faces caught Paul's attention briefly. Sardaukar officers measuring the preparations within this room, planning and scheming yet for a way to turn defeat into victory. Paul's attention came at last to a tall blonde woman, green-eyed, a face of patrician beauty, classic in its hauteur, untouched by tears, completely undefeated. Without being told it, Paul knew her. Princess Royal, B'nai Gesserit trained, a face that time vision had shown him in many aspects, Irulan. There's my key, he thought. Then he saw a movement in the clustered people. A face and figure emerged. Fufa Hawat, the seamed old features with darkly stained lips, the hunched shoulders, the look of fragile age about him. There's Fufa Hawat, Paul said. Let him stand free, Gurney. My lord, Gurney said. Let him stand free, Paul repeated. Gurney nodded. Hawat shambled forward as a Fremen lance was lifted and replaced behind him. The rheumy eyes peered at Paul, measuring, seeking. Paul stepped forward one pace, sensed the tense, waiting movement of the Emperor and his people. Howard's gaze stabbed past Paul, and the old man said, Lady Jessica, I but learned this day how I've wronged you in my thoughts. You needn't forgive. Paul waited, but his mother remained silent. Fufa, old friend, Paul said. As you can see, my back is toward no door. The universe is full of doors, Howard said. Am I my father's son? Paul asked. More like your grandfather's, Howard rasped. You've his manner and the look of him in your eyes. Yet I'm my father's son, Paul said. For I say to you, Fufa, that in payment for your years of service to my family, you may now ask anything you wish of me. Anything at all. Do you need my life now, Fufa? It is yours. Paul stepped forward a pace, hands at his side, seeing the look of awareness grow in Howard's eyes. He realizes that I know of the treachery, Paul thought. Pitching his voice to carry in a half-whisper for Howard's ears alone, Paul said, I mean this, Fufa. If you're to strike me, do it now. I have wanted to stand before you once more, my Duke, Howard said. And Paul became aware for the first time of the effort the old man exerted to keep from falling. Paul reached out, supported Howard by the shoulders, feeling the muscle tremors beneath his hands. Is there pain, old friend? Paul asked. There is pain, my Duke, Howard agreed, but the pleasure is greater. He half-turned in Paul's arms, extended his left hand, palm up, toward the Emperor, exposing the tiny needle cupped against the fingers. See, Majesty, he called. See your traitor's needle? Do you think that I, who've given my life to service of the Atreides, would give them less now? Paul staggered as the old man sagged in his arms, felt the depth there, the utter flaccidity. Gently, Paul lowered Howard to the floor, straightened and signed for guardsmen to carry the body away. Silence held the hall while his command was obeyed. A look of deadly waiting held the Emperor's face now. Eyes that had never admitted fear admitted it at last. Majesty, Paul said, noted the jerk of surprised attention in the tall Princess Royal. The words had been uttered with the Bene Gesserit controlled atonals, carrying in it every shade of contempt and scorn that Paul could put there. Bene Gesserit trained indeed, Paul thought. The Emperor cleared his throat, said, Perhaps my respected kinsman believes he has things all his own way now. Nothing could be more remote from fact. You have violated the convention, I used atomics against a natural feature of the desert, Paul said. It was in my way, and I was in a hurry to get to you, Majesty, to ask your explanation for some of your strange activities. There's a massed armada of the great houses in space over Arrakis right now, the Emperor said. I've but to say the word, and they'll... Oh yes, Paul said. I almost forgot about them. He searched through the Emperor's suite until he saw the faces of the two guildsmen, spoke aside to Gurney. Are those the guild agents, Gurney? The two fat ones dressed in grey over there? Yes, my lord. You two, Paul said, pointing. Get out of there immediately and dispatch messages that will get that fleet on its way home. After this, you'll ask my permission before the guild doesn't take your orders, the taller of the two barked. He and his companion pushed through to the barrier lances, which were raised at a nod from Paul. The two men stepped out, and the taller levelled an arm at Paul, said, You may very well be under embargo for your... If I hear any more nonsense from either of you, Paul said, I'll give the order that'll destroy all spice production on Arrakis, forever. Are you mad? The tall guildsman demanded. He fell back half a step. You grant that I have the power to do this thing, then? Paul asked. The guildsman seemed to stare into space for a moment. Then, yes, you could do it, but you must not. Ah, Paul said and nodded to himself. Guild navigators, both of you, eh? Yes. The shorter of the pair said, You would blind yourself too, and condemn us all to slow death. Have you any idea what it means to be deprived of the spice liquor once you're addicted? The eye that looks ahead to the safe course is closed forever, Paul said. The guild is crippled. Humans become little isolated clusters on their isolated planets. You know, I might do this thing out of pure spite, or out of ennui. Let us talk this over privately, the taller guildsman said. I'm sure we can come to some compromise, that is, send the message to your people over Arrakis, Paul said. I grow tired of this argument. If that fleet over us doesn't leave soon, there'll be no need for us to talk. He nodded toward his communications men at the side of the hall. You may use our equipment. First we must discuss this, the tall guildsman said. We cannot just do it, Paul barked. The power to destroy a thing is the absolute control over it. You've agreed I have that power. We are not here to discuss how to negotiate or to compromise. You will obey my orders or suffer the immediate consequences. He means it, the shorter guildsman said, and Paul saw the fear grip them. Slowly the two crossed to the Fremen communications equipment. Will they obey? Gurney asked. They have a narrow vision of time, Paul said. They can see ahead to a blank wall marking the consequences of disobedience. Every guild navigator on every ship over us can look ahead to that same wall. They'll obey. Paul turned back to look at the Emperor, said, When they permitted you to mount your father's throne, it was only on the assurance that you'd keep the spice flowing. You failed them, Majesty. Do you know the consequences? Nobody permitted me to. Stop playing the fool, Paul barked. The guild is like a village beside a river. They need the water, but can only dip out what they require. They cannot dam the river and control it, because that focuses attention on what they take. It brings down eventual destruction. The spice flow, that's their river, and I have built a dam, but my dam is such that you cannot destroy it without destroying the river. The Emperor brushed a hand through his red hair, glanced at the backs of the two guildsmen. Even your Bene Gesserit truthsayer is trembling, Paul said. There are other poisons the Reverend Mother can use for their tricks. but once they've used the spice liquor, the others no longer work. The old woman pulled her shapeless black robes around her, pressed forward out of the crowd to stand at the barrier lances. "Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohaim," Paul said. "It's been a long time since Caladan, hasn't it?" She looked past him at his mother, said, "Well, Jessica, I see that your son is indeed the one. For that you can be forgiven even the abomination of your daughter." Paul, still to cold, piercing anger, said, "You've never had the right or cause to forgive my mother anything." The old woman locked eyes with him. "Try your tricks on me, old witch," Paul said. "Where's your Gom Jabbar? Try looking into that place where you dare not look. You'll find me there staring out at you." The old woman dropped her gaze. "Have you nothing to say?" Paul demanded. "I welcome you to the ranks of humans," she muttered. "Don't besmirch that." Paul raised his voice. "Observe her, comrades. This is a B'nai Gesserit Reverend Mother, patient in a patient cause. She could wait with her sisters 90 generations for the proper combination of genes and environment to produce the one person their schemes required. Observe her. She knows now that the 90 generations have produced that person. Here I stand, but I will never do her bidding." "Jessica," the old woman screamed. "Silence him. Silence him yourself," Jessica said. Paul glared at the old woman. "For your part in all this, I could gladly have you strangled," he said. "You couldn't prevent it." He snapped as she stiffened in rage. "But I think it better punishment that you live out your years never able to touch me or bend me to a single thing your scheming desires." "Jessica, what have you done?" the old woman demanded. "I'll give you only one thing," Paul said. "You saw part of what the race needs, but how poorly you saw it. You think to control human breeding and intermix a select few according to your master plan. How little you understand of what. You mustn't speak of these things," the old woman hissed. "Silence," Paul roared. The words seemed to take substance as it twisted through the air between them under Paul's control. The old woman reeled back into the arms of those behind her, face blank with shock at the power with which he had seized her psyche. "Jessica," she whispered. "Jessica." "I remember your Gom Jabbar," Paul said. "You remember mine. I can kill you with a word." The Fremen around the hall glanced knowingly at each other. Did the legend not say, "And his word shall carry death eternal to those who stand against righteousness"? Paul turned his attention to the tall Princess Royal standing beside her Emperor father. Keeping his eyes focused on her, he said, "Majesty, we both know the way out of our difficulty." The Emperor glanced at his daughter, back to Paul. "You dare? You, an adventurer without family, a nobody from—" "You've already admitted who I am," Paul said. "Royal kinsman, you said. Let's stop this nonsense. I am your ruler," the Emperor said. Paul glanced at the guildsmen standing now at the communications equipment and facing him. One of them nodded. "I could force it," Paul said. "You will not dare," the Emperor grated. Paul merely stared at him. The Princess Royal put a hand on her father's arm. "Father," she said, and her voice was silky soft, soothing. "Don't try your tricks on me," the Emperor said. He looked at her. "You don't need to do this, daughter. You've other resources but here's a man fit to be your son," she said. The old Reverend Mother, her composure regained, forced her way to the Emperor's side, leaned close to his ear, and whispered. "She pleads your case," Jessica said. Paul continued to look at the golden-haired princess. Aside to his mother, he said, "That's Irulan, the oldest, isn't it?" "Yes." Chani moved up on Paul's other side, said, "Do you wish me to leave, Muad'Dib?" He glanced at her. "Leave? You'll never again leave my side." "There's nothing binding between us," Chani said. Paul looked down at her for a silent moment, then, "Speak only truth with me, my Sahaya." As she started to reply, he silenced her with a finger to her lips. "That which binds us cannot be loosed," he said. "Now watch these matters closely, for I wish to see this room later through your wisdom." The Emperor and his truthsayer were carrying on a heated, low-voiced argument. Paul spoke to his mother. She reminds him that as part of their agreement to place the B'nai Gesserit on the throne, and Irulan is the one they've groomed for it. "Was that their plan?" Jessica said. "Isn't it obvious?" Paul asked. "I see the signs," Jessica snapped. "My question was meant to remind you that you should not try to teach me those matters in which I instructed you." Paul glanced at her, caught a cold smile on her lips. Gurney Halleck leaned between them, said, "I remind you, my lord, that there's a Harkonnen in that bunch." He nodded toward the dark-haired Fade Rafa pressed against the barrier lance on the left, the one with the squinting eyes there on the left. "As evil a face as ever I saw. You promised me once that—" "Thank you, Gurney," Paul said. "It's for Na Baron." "Baron, now that the old man's dead," Gurney said. He'll do for what I've in. Can you take him, Gurney? My lord jests. That argument between the Emperor and his witch has gone on long enough, don't you think, Mother? She nodded. Indeed. Paul raised his voice, called out to the Emperor, Majesty, is there a Harkonnen among you? Royal disdain revealed itself in the way the Emperor turned to look at Paul. I believe my entourage has been placed under the protection of your ducal word, he said. My question was for information only, Paul said. I wish to know if a Harkonnen is officially a part of your entourage or if a Harkonnen is merely hiding behind a technicality out of cowardice. The Emperor's smile was calculating. Anyone accepted into the Imperial Company is a member of my entourage. You have the word of a duke, Paul said, but Muad'Dib is another matter. He may not recognize your definition of what constitutes an entourage. My friend Gurney Halleck wishes to kill a Harkonnen. If he can, Lee, Feyd-Rautha shouted. He pressed against the barrier lance. Your father named this vendetta, Atreides. You call me coward while you hide among your women and offer to send a lackey against me? The old truthsayer whispered something fiercely into the Emperor's ear, but he pushed her aside, said, Canley, is it? There are strict rules for Canley. Paul, put a stop to this, Jessica said. My lord, Gurney said, you promised me on my day against the Harkonnens. You've had your day against them, Paul said, and he felt a Harlequin abandon take over his emotions. He slipped his robe and hood from his shoulders, handed them to his mother with his belt and Cry's knife, began unstrapping his stillsuit. He sensed now that the universe focused on this moment. There's no need for this, Jessica said. There are easier ways, Paul. Paul stepped out of his stillsuit, slipped the Cry's knife from its sheath in his mother's hands. I know, he said. Poison, an assassin, all the old familiar ways. You promised me a Harkonnen, Gurney hissed, and Paul marked the rage in the man's face, the way the Inkvine scar stood out dark and ridged. You owe it to me, my lord. Have you suffered more from them than I? Paul asked. My sister, Gurney rasped. My years in the slave pits. My father, Paul said. My good friends and companions, Pfuffa Hawat and Duncan Idaho. My years as a fugitive without rank or succour. And one more thing. It is now Canley, and you know as well as I the rules that must prevail. Halleck's shoulders sagged. My lord, if that swine, he's no more than a beast, you'd spurn with your foot and discard the shoe because it had been contaminated. Call in an executioner, if you must, or let me do it, but don't offer yourself to... Muad'Dib need not do this thing, Chani said. He glanced at her, saw the fear for him in her eyes. But the Duke Paul must, he said. This is a Harkonnen animal, Gurney rasped. Paul hesitated on the point of revealing his own Harkonnen ancestry, stopped at a sharp look from his mother, said merely, But this being has a human shape, Gurney, and deserves human doubt. Gurney said, If he so much as... Please stand aside, Paul said. He hefted the Cry's knife, pushed Gurney gently aside. Gurney, Jessica said. She touched Gurney's arm. He's like his grandfather in this mood. Don't distract him. It's the only thing you can do for him now. And she thought, Great mother, what irony. The Emperor was studying Feyd-Rautha, seeing the heavy shoulders, the thick muscles. He turned to look at Paul, a stringy whipcord of a youth, not as desiccated as the Arrakeen natives, but with ribs that account, and sunken in the flanks so that the ripple and gather of muscles could be followed under the skin. Jessica leaned close to Paul, pitched her voice through his ears alone. One thing, son. Sometimes a dangerous person is prepared by the Bene Gesserit, a word implanted into the deepest recesses by the old pleasure-pain methods. The word sound most frequently used is Uroshnor. If this one's been prepared, as I strongly suspect, that word uttered in his ear will render his muscles flaccid and... I want no special advantage for this one, Paul said. Step back out of my way. Gurney spoke to her. Why is he doing this? Does he think to get himself killed and achieve martyrdom? This Fremen religious prattle, is that what clouds his reason? Jessica hid her face in her hands, realizing that she did not know fully why Paul took this course. She could feel death in the room and knew that the changed Paul was capable of such a thing as Gurney suggested. Every talent within her focused on the need to protect her son, but there was nothing she could do. Is it this religious prattle? Gurney insisted. Be silent, Jessica whispered, and pray. The Emperor's face was touched by an abrupt smile. If Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, of my entourage, so wishes, he said, I relieve him of all restraint and give him freedom to choose his own course in this. The Emperor waved a hand toward Paul's Fedakin guards. One of your rabble has my belt and short blade. If Feyd-Rautha wishes it, he may meet you with my blade in his hand. I wish it, Feyd-Rautha said, and Paul saw the elation on the man's face. He's overconfident, Paul thought. There's a natural advantage I can accept. Get the Emperor's blade, Paul said, and watched as his command was obeyed. Put it on the floor there. He indicated the place of his foot. Clear the Imperial rabble back against the wall and let the Harkonnen stand clear. A flurry of robes, scraping of feet, low-voiced commands and protests accompanied obedience to Paul's command. The guildsmen remained standing near the communications equipment. They frowned at Paul in obvious indecision. They're accustomed to seeing the future, Paul thought. In this place and time they're blind, even as I am. And he sampled the time winds, sensing the turmoil, the storm nexus that now focused on this moment and place. Even the faint gaps were closed now. He was the unborn jihad he knew. He was the race consciousness that he had known once as his own terrible purpose. He was reason enough for a Kwisatz Haderach or a Lisan al-Gaib, or even the halting schemes of the Bene Gesserit. The race of humans had felt its own dormancy, sensed itself grown stale and knew now only the need to experience turmoil in which the genes would mingle and the strong new mixture survive. All humans were alive as an unconscious single organism in this moment, experiencing a kind of sexual heat that could override any barrier. And Paul saw how futile were any efforts of his to change any smallest bit of this. He had fought to oppose the jihad within himself, but the jihad would be. His legions would rage out from Arrakis even without him. They needed only the legend he already had become. He had shown them the way, given them mastery even over the guild which must have the spice to exist. A sense of failure pervaded him, and he saw it through that Phaedra Harkonnen had slipped out of the torn uniform, stripped down to a fighting girdle with a male core. This is the climax, Paul thought. From here the future will open, the clouds part onto a kind of glory, and if I die here, they'll say I sacrificed myself that my spirit might lead them, and if I live, they'll say nothing can oppose Muad'Dib. Is the Atreides ready? Phaedra cowled, using the words of the ancient Canly ritual. Paul chose to answer him in the Fremen way. May thy knife chip and shatter. He pointed to the Emperor's blade on the floor, indicating that Phaedra should advance and take it. Keeping his attention on Paul, Phaedra picked up the knife, balancing it a moment in his hand to get the feel of it. Excitement kindled in him. This was a fight he had dreamed about. Man against man, skill against skill, with no shields intervening. He could see a way to power opening before him, because the Emperor surely would reward whoever killed this troublesome Duke. The reward might even be that haughty daughter and a share of the throne. And this yokel Duke, this backworld adventurer, could not possibly be a match for a Harkonnen trained in every device and every treachery by 1,000 arena combats, and the yokel had no way of knowing he faced more weapons than a knife here. Let us see if you're proof against poison, Phaedra thought. He saluted Paul with the Emperor's blade, said, Meet your death, fool. Shall we fight, cousin? Paul asked, and he cat-footed forward, eyes on the waiting blade, his body crouched low with his own milk-white cries knife pointing out as though an extension of his arm. They circled each other, bare feet grating on the floor, watching with eyes intent for the slightest opening. How beautifully you dance, Phaedra said. He's a talker, Paul thought. There's another weakness. He grows uneasy in the face of silence. Have you been shriven? Phaedra asked. Still, Paul circled in silence. And the old Reverend Mother, watching the fight from the press of the Emperor's suite, felt herself trembling. The Atreides youth had called the Harkonnen cousin. It could only mean he knew the ancestry they shared, easy to understand because he was the Kwisatz Haderach, but the words forced her to focus on the only thing that mattered to her here. This could be a major catastrophe for the Bene Gesserit breeding scheme. She had seen something of what Paul had seen here, that Phaedra might kill but not be victorious. Another thought, though, almost overwhelmed her. Two end products of this long and costly program faced each other in a fight to the death that might easily claim both of them. If both died here, that would leave only Phaedra's bastard daughter, still a baby, an unknown, an unmeasured factor, and Alia, the abomination. Perhaps you have only pagan rites here, Phaedra said. Would you like the Emperor's truthsayer to prepare your spirit for its journey? Paul smiled, circling to the right, alert, his black thoughts suppressed by the needs of the moment. Phaedra leaped, feinting with right hand, but with the knife shifted in a blow to his left hand. Paul dodged easily, noting the shield conditioned hesitation in Phaedra's thrust. Still, it was not as great a shield conditioning as some Paul had seen, and he sensed that Phaedra had fought before against unshielded foes. Does an Atreides run or stand and fight? Phaedra asked. Paul resumed his silent circling. Idaho's words came back to him, the words of training from the long-ago practice floor on Caladan. Use the first moments in study. You may miss many an opportunity for quick victory this way, but the moments of study are insurance of success. Take your time and be sure. Perhaps you think this dance prolongs your life a few moments, Phaedra said. Well and good. He stopped the circling, straightened. Paul had seen enough for a first approximation. Feyd-Rautha led to the left side, presenting the right hip as though the mailed fighting girdle could protect his entire side. It was the action of a man trained to the shield and with a knife in both hands. Or, and Paul hesitated, the girdle was more than it seemed. The Harkonnen appeared too confident against a man who had this day led the forces of victory against Sardaukar legions. Feyd-Rautha noted the hesitation and said, "Where I prolong the inevitable. You but keep me from exercising my rights over this ball of dirt. If it's a flip dart," Paul thought, "it's a cunning one. The girdle shows no signs of tampering. Why don't you speak?" Feyd-Rautha demanded. Paul resumed his probing circle, allowing himself a cold smile at the tone of unease in Feyd-Rautha's voice, evidence that the pressure of silence was building. "You smile, eh?" Feyd-Rautha asked, and he leaped in mid-sentence. Expecting the slight hesitation, Paul almost failed to evade the downflash of blade, felt its tip scratch his left arm. He silenced for sudden pain there, his mind flooded with realization that the earlier hesitation had been a trick, an overfeint. He was more of an opponent than he had expected. There would be tricks within tricks within tricks. "Your own Fufahawa taught me some of my skills," Feyd-Rautha said. "He gave me first blood. Too bad the old fool didn't live to see it." And Paul recalled that Idaho had once said, "Expect only what happens in the fight. That way you'll never be surprised." Again the two circled each other, crouched, cautious. Paul saw the return of elation to his opponent, wondered at it. Did a scratch signify that much to the man? Unless there were poison on the blade. But how could there be? His own men had handled the weapon, snooped it before passing it. They were too well trained to miss an obvious thing like that. "That woman you were talking to over there," Feyd-Rautha said, "the little one, is she something special to you? A pet, perhaps? Will she deserve my special attentions?" Paul remained silent, probing with his inner senses, examining the blood from the wound, finding a trace of soporific from the Emperor's blade. He realigned his own metabolism to match this threat and changed the molecules of the soporific, but he felt a thrill of doubt. They'd been prepared with soporific on a blade. A soporific. Nothing to alert a poison snooper, but strong enough to slow the muscles it touched. His enemies had their own plans within plans, their own stacked treacheries. Again Feyd-Rautha leaped, stabbing. Paul, the smile frozen on his face, fainted with slowness as though inhibited by the drug, and at the last instant dodged to meet the down-flashing arm on the Cry's knife point. Feyd-Rautha ducked sideways and was out and away. His blade shifted to his left hand, and the measure of him that only a slight paleness of jaw betrayed the acid pain where Paul had cut him. Let him know his own moment of doubt, Paul thought. Let him suspect poison. "Treachery," Feyd-Rautha shouted. "He's poisoned me. I do feel poison in my arm." Paul dropped his cloak of silence, said, "Only a little acid to counter the soporific on the Emperor's blade." Feyd-Rautha matched Paul's cold smile, lifted blade in left hand for a mock salute. His eyes glared rage behind the knife. Paul shifted his Cry's knife to the left hand, matching his opponent. Again they circled, probing. Feyd-Rautha began closing the space between them, edging in, knife held high, anger showing itself in squint of eye instead of jaw. He feinted right and under, and they were pressed against each other, knife hands gripped, straining. Paul, cautious of Feyd-Rautha's right hip where he suspected a poison flip dart, forced the turn to the right. He almost failed to see the needle point flick out beneath the belt line. A shift and a giving in. Feyd-Rautha's motion warned him. The tiny point missed Paul's flesh by the barest fraction. On the left hip. Treachery within treachery within treachery. Paul reminded himself. Using Bene Gesserit-trained muscles, he sagged to catch a reflex in Feyd-Rautha, but the necessity of avoiding the tiny point jutting from his opponent's hip threw Paul off just enough that he missed his footing and found himself thrown hard to the floor, Feyd-Rautha on top. "You see it there on my hip?" Feyd-Rautha whispered. "You're deaf, fool." And he began twisting himself around, forcing the poison needle closer and closer. "It'll stop your muscles and my knife will finish you. There will be never a trace left to detect." Paul strained, hearing the silent screams in his mind, his cell-stamped ancestors demanding that he use the secret word to slow Feyd-Rautha, to save himself. "I will not say it," Paul gasped. Feyd-Rautha gaped at him, caught in the merest fraction of hesitation. It was enough for Paul to find the weakness of balance in one of his opponent's leg muscles, and their positions were reversed. Feyd-Rautha lay partly underneath, with right hip high, unable to turn because of the tiny needle point caught against the floor beneath him. Paul twisted his left hand free, aided by the lubrication of blood from his arm, thrust once hard up underneath Feyd-Rautha's jaw. The point slid home into the brain. Feyd-Rautha jerked and sagged back, still held partly on his side by the needle embedded in the floor. Breathing deeply to restore his calm, Paul pushed himself away and got to his feet. He stood over the body, knife in hand, raised his eyes with deliberate slowness to look across the room at the Emperor. Majesty, Paul said, your force is reduced by one more. Shall we now shed sham and pretense? Shall we now discuss what must be? Your daughter wed to me in the way I opened for an Atreides to sit on the throne. The Emperor turned, looked at Count Fenring. The Count met his stare, grey eyes against green. The thought lay there, clearly between them, their association so long that understanding could be achieved with a glance. Kill this upstart for me, the Emperor was saying. The Atreides is young and resourceful, yes, but he is also tired from long effort and he'd be no match for you anyway. Call him out now. You know the way of it. Kill him. Slowly, Fenring moved his head, a prolonged turning until he faced Paul. Do it, the Emperor hissed. The Count focused on Paul, seeing if eyes his Lady Margot had trained in the Bene Gesserit way, aware of the mystery and hidden grandeur about this Atreides youth. I could kill him, Fenring thought, and he knew this for a truth. Something in his own secretive depth stayed the Count then, and he glimpsed briefly, inadequately, the advantage he held over Paul, a way of hiding from the youth, a furtiveness of person and motives that no eye could penetrate. Paul, aware of some of this from the way the time nexus boiled, understood at last why he had never seen Fenring along the webs of prescience. Fenring was one of the might-have-beens, an almost Kwisatz Haderach, crippled by a flaw in the genetic pattern. A eunuch, his talent concentrated into furtiveness and inner seclusion. A deep compassion for the Count flowed through Paul, the first sense of brotherhood he'd ever experienced. Fenring, reading Paul's emotion, said, Majesty, I must refuse. Rage overcame Shaddam IV. He took 2 short steps through the entourage, cuffed Fenring viciously across the jaw. A dark flush spread up and over the Count's face. He looked directly at the Emperor, spoke with deliberate lack of emphasis. We have been friends, Majesty. What I do now is out of friendship. I shall forget that you struck me. Paul cleared his throat, said, You were speaking of the throne, Majesty. The Emperor whirled, glared at Paul. I sit on the throne, he barked. You shall have a throne on Salusa Secundus, Paul said. I put down my arms and came here on your word of bond, the Emperor shouted. You dare threaten. Your person is safe in my presence, Paul said, and Atreides promised it. Muad'Dib, however, sentences you to your prison planet, but have no fear, Majesty. I will ease the harshness of the palace with all the powers at my disposal. It shall become a garden world, full of gentle things. As the hidden import of Paul's words grew in the Emperor's mind, he glared across the room at Paul. Now we see true motives, he sneered. Indeed, Paul said. And what of Arrakis? The Emperor asked. Another garden world full of gentle things? The Fremen have the word of Muad'Dib, Paul said. There will be flowing water here, open to the sky, and green oases rich with good things. But we have the spice to think of too. Thus there will always be desert in Arrakis, and fierce winds, and trials to toughen a man. We Fremen have a saying, God created Arrakis to train the faithful. One cannot go against the word of God. The old truth-sayer, the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mahaim, had her own view of the hidden meaning in Paul's words now. She glimpsed the jihad and said, You cannot loose these people upon the universe. You will think back to the gentle ways of the Sardaukar, Paul snapped. You cannot, she whispered. You're a truth-sayer, Paul said. Review your words. He glanced at the Princess Royal, back to the Emperor. Best were done quickly, Majesty. The Emperor turned a stricken look upon his daughter. She touched his arm, spoke soothingly. For this I was trained, father. He took a deep breath. You cannot stay this thing, the old truth-sayer muttered. The Emperor straightened, standing stiffly with a look of remembered dignity. Who will negotiate for you, kinsman? He asked. Paul turned, saw his mother, her eyes heavy-lidded, standing with Chani and a squad of Fedakan guards. He crossed to them, stood looking down at Chani. I know the reasons, Chani whispered. If it must be, Usul. Paul, hearing the secret tears in her voice, touched her cheek. My Sahaya need fear nothing, ever, he whispered. He dropped his arm, faced his mother. You will negotiate for me, mother, with Chani by your side. She has wisdom and sharp eyes, and it is wisely said that no one bargains tougher than a Fremen. She'll be looking through the eyes of her love for me, and with the thought of her sons-to-be, what they will need. Listen to her. Jessica sensed a harsh calculation in her son. Put down a shudder. What are your instructions? She asked. The Emperor's entire Chom Company holdings as dowry, he said. Entire? She was shocked, almost speechless. He is to be stripped. I'll want an earldom and Chom directorship for Gurney Halleck, and him in the fief of Caladan. There will be titles and attendant power for every surviving Atreides man, not excepting the lowliest trooper. What of the Fremen? Jessica asked. The Fremen are mine, Paul said. What they receive shall be dispensed by Muad'Dib. It'll begin with Stilgar as governor on Arrakis, but that can wait. And for me, Jessica asked, is there something you wish? Perhaps Caladan, she said, looking at Gurney. I'm not certain. I've become too much the Fremen, and the Reverend Mother. I need a time of peace and stillness in which to think. That you shall have, Paul said, and anything else that Gurney or I can give you. Jessica nodded, feeling suddenly old and tired. She looked at Chani. And for the royal concubine? No title for me, Chani whispered. Nothing. I beg of you. Paul stared down into her eyes, remembering her suddenly as she had stood once with little Leto in her arms. Their child now dead in this violence. I swear to you now, he whispered, that you'll need no title. That woman over there will be my wife and you, but a concubine, because this is a political thing and we must weld peace out of this moment, and list the great houses of the Landsraad. We must obey the forms. Yet that princess shall have no more of me than my name, no child of mine, nor touch, nor softness of glance, nor instant of desire. So you say now, Chani said. She glanced across the room at the tall princess. Do you know so little of my son? Jessica whispered. See that princess standing there, so haughty and confident. They say she has pretensions of a literary nature. Let us hope she finds solace in such things. She'll have little else. A bitter laugh escaped Jessica. Think on it, Chani. That princess will have the name, yet she'll live as less than a concubine, never to know a moment of tenderness from the man to whom she's bound, while we, Chani, we who carry the name of concubine, history will call us wives.